The Barrowland Ballroom, sometimes referred to as simply the Barrowland, is in the East End of Glasgow, the largest city in Scotland. Although it's in an area with a rough reputation, it's one of the major dance halls in the city, and working class people flock to it from all around. Dancing to live music was still a favorite pastime here, and the city had a whole host of clubs and music venues, including Green's Playhouse, the Astoria, the Cameo, the Tudor, the Berkeley, the Majestic, and the West End Ballroom. But there was something special about the Barrowland. Maybe it was the crisscross pattern of the dance floor, constructed from specially imported Canadian maple, and rumored to be sprung with 1,000 halved tennis balls underneath. Or maybe it was just the showmanship of the bands, entertainers, comedians, and novelty acts that played there. Though far from its counterparts in the more metropolitan London, the Barrowland, as a heart of nightlife for the city, had its own unique carnival atmosphere, and it enjoyed its own fair share of notoriety. The Barrowland had been operating since 1934 and was gutted in a fire in 1958, but had been rebuilt and reopened in 1960, on Christmas Eve no less, to continue its dubious, and in the eyes of some, sinful life. Recollecting during his retirement, one former Glasgow policeman referred to it as Sodom and Gomorrah. Thursdays and Saturdays were the over 25 nights, and while the clientele age limit may seem a bit arbitrary to us now, it stood as a bit of an unspoken rule. Thursday nights from 8 p.m. to midnight at the Barrowland were called Palais Nights, but the colloquial term commonly used by everyone for the over 25 event was grab a granny night. While some used the opportunity to simply get drunk, dance a little bit, and flirt, many people attending Palais Night on Thursdays were married. But they might not have necessarily been going with their partners, and most would not readily admit to having been to the Barrowland for fear their spouses might find out. It was well known that if you wanted a bit more than a dance, then Thursday night was the evening to visit the Barrowland, a Glasgow resident recalled years later. I don't think many used their real name on a Thursday night. Folks were cautious. Anything that happened after dancing was usually a one-off. You could tell who was wanting a fumble and who wasn't, so it was easy pickings, really. In fact, it was often said that people slipped their wedding rings off their finger by the time they had walked through the doors. So it could be understood why 25-year-old Patricia Docker, a married mother with a 4-year-old son, told her parents that she was going to the Majestic Ballroom and not the Barrowland on the evening of Thursday, February 22nd, 1968. A nurse at the Victoria Infirmary, she had been staying with her mother and father for a short time, and by some accounts this was due to a recent separation from her husband, Alex. Alex was serving in the Royal Air Force and was away on duty, south in England. Whether Patricia did go to the Majestic, located on Hope Street, is uncertain, but at some point in the evening she made her way to the Barrowland, and into its pulsating whirl and vibrant rush, where she would meet the man responsible for her death. Welcome to the Unresolved podcast. I'm your host, Michael Whelan, and today's story is one from the heart of the swinging 60s, set against the backdrop of fast music, slick back hair, short skirts, and what some would consider loose morals. A center for city nightlife, the Barrowland Ballroom would become the predatory hunting ground for one of the most notorious murderers in Scottish history. Despite a nationwide manhunt and the effort of hundreds of police officers, reporters, and investigators, the killer would never be caught, and his true identity, beyond that of a journalist's flippant nickname, remains a mystery to this day. This is the story of Bible John. It was early on the morning of Friday, February 23, 1968, when 67-year-old cabinet maker and joiner Morris Goodman found the body. He was taking a shortcut through Carmichael Place on his way to work, and at first he thought a drunk had passed out in the lane, but when he nudged the body with his foot, he realized that this was not the case. It was like touching a block of ice, he would later remember. He raced home to phone the police, and for some reason that not even he could explain, he had originally thought that the body belonged to a man. Thinking that this was just some vagrant who had died of exposure earlier that night, the police did not seem too concerned to rush to the scene. In fact, the first investigators to arrive were 2 local traffic police who just happened to wander into the area. By 8 a.m., detectives had finally made their way to Carmichael Place, and at first glance they knew that this was not some derelict who had died in the cold. The woman was lying on her back, nude but for a single shoe, with her head turned to the right. Police would determine that she had been beaten, raped, and strangled. According to some accounts, the killer had used one of her stockings, but most reports state that no ligature was found, and that the investigators initially thought that a belt might have been used, due to the bruising and marks around her neck. No clothing or handbag was found at the crime scene, and a sanitary napkin had been discovered lying near the body. It was presumably hers, and the coroner was later able to determine that the victim had been menstruating at the time of her death. Eerily enough, her body had been found just yards away in a lane adjacent to her parents' home at 29 Langside Place. A police canvass of the nearby houses revealed only a vague, unsubstantiated report of a woman whose description matched the victim entering a car in the area, as well as a report of a neighbor hearing a woman cry, "Leave me alone," during the prior evening. A journalist was hosting a party in the neighborhood, and despite the substantial guest list, no one remembered seeing or hearing anything unusual that night. Talk of the gruesome crime soon spread throughout the neighborhood, and the gossip eventually found its way to Victoria Infirmary. Some nurses wondered whether it could have been a patient who had wandered out of the hospital and later died of exposure. 2 of Patricia's co-workers, the head matron and her assistant, viewed the body, but due to the severe facial trauma, they could not identify it. It was not until an ambulance driver saw the corpse and recognized her as a nurse who worked there that police would begin to figure out who she was. Patricia's father, John Wilson, had read a description of the woman in the evening paper. Though he and his wife had been worried that Patricia had not yet returned from her night at the Majestic, they assumed that she had remained out with her nursing friends and that she would be returning home at any moment. Armed with a recent photograph of his daughter, John made his way to the police station, where they took his information and asked him to view the body at the morgue, where he made an immediate identification. Since Patricia had not mentioned the Barrowland Ballroom to her parents the night before, police officials concentrated their efforts on the Majestic, the place she told them that she was going. A witness did come forward to state that he had danced with Patricia at the Majestic that night, only to change his story several days later when he realized that he had confused the date with another evening. It would be days, perhaps even weeks, before they learned she went to the Barrowland Ballroom. By then, the trail had become cold. This lapse in time between the initial inquiries and the discovery that Patricia had really been to the Barrowland would prove frustrating to detectives and family members. Whether this was a deliberate ruse on Patricia's part or an impromptu change of plans can't be said for certain. Though she was apparently separated from her husband, she was still technically married, and the Barrowland's reputation would certainly have been known to her mother and father. If it was a sin of omission, it can certainly be understood, because that's a tactic lots of sons and daughters have used countless times on unwitting parents who might not have known where their kids were really going. However, if Patricia had been at the Majestic first and then continued on to the Barrowland, it could have been an entirely spur-of-the-moment lark. The Majestic closed at 10:30 that night, but the Barrowland was open until midnight, so what better way to prolong the evening's entertainment than by moving to another venue? But for whatever reason, this misdirection would cost the investigation time and resources that would better have been used elsewhere, and which might have led to Patricia's killer. No one interviewed who had been at the Barrowland that Thursday night could remember seeing Patricia leave with anyone, though some patrons remembered seeing her dancing with several men, one of whom had red hair. Whether or not the hair color was significant at the time of the original inquiry is uncertain, but it would come to play an important part in the subsequent investigations. However, it's not like the suspect in question had an eye patch or a missing arm. Red hair is not exactly uncommon, and young red-haired men attending a Scottish nightclub would not be a rare occurrence. It was hoped that somehow Patricia's clothing could be traced and found, but her knit yellow dress and gray duffel coat with blue fur collar were never located. Policemen dredging the nearby river cart did recover Patricia's bracelet, part of a watch case, and her missing handbag. For a brief moment, even Patricia's estranged husband, on duty in Lincolnshire, was considered a suspect, but he was easily cleared after providing a solid alibi. With a lack of any suitable evidence, and the fact that it was impossible to verify her movements after she attended the Barrowland that fateful Thursday, the trail went cold, and the investigation was wound down after 2 weeks. The police chalked it up as a case of meeting the wrong person in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's Saturday, August 16th, 1969, and 32-year-old Jemima McDonald is headed to the Barrowland Ballroom for a night of recreation. Nicknamed Mima in some contemporary newspaper reports, the unmarried mother of 3 has left her children in the care of her sister, Margaret. Jemima's 3 children, a 12-year-old daughter named Elizabeth and 2 younger sons, Andrew and Alan, who are 9 and 7 years old respectively, were dropped off at Margaret's home, whose flat was just across the landing from Jemima's own at 15 McKeith Street in Bridgeton. It has been 18 months since the murder of Patricia Docker, and that unsolved crime is the furthest thing from Jemima's mind. Her hair is still in curlers when she sets out. She has tied a headscarf over them, and plans on removing the scarf and curlers when she arrives at the dance hall ladies' powder room. With her hair perfect to start off the evening's dancing, Jemima is set to have a good time. Most of Jemima's friends were already married, so she often ventured out to the dance halls alone. However, her falling off the grid that night was very unlike her. When Jemima did not return to collect her children that Sunday morning, Margaret became worried. That day, she overheard some of the neighborhood children talking about the body in a nearby abandoned tenement, though she brushed it off, not daring to think the worst. The tenement had a notorious reputation. By day, it was a place where children would play, but at night, it was rumored to be a place where prostitutes would bring their customers, or a haven for vagrants to shelter from the rain. By Monday, August 18th, she became so frantic that she mustered up the courage to enter the dilapidated building at 23 McKeith Street, less than 30 yards from her own home. There, she found what she first thought to be a discarded tailor's dummy in a bed recess on the ground floor, but then she noticed the blood on the body's instantly recognizable face. Jemima had been beaten, raped, and strangled with a stocking. Her clothing was in disarray, with her black pinafore dress and frilled white blouse torn, and her underwear ripped as if in a frenzy. Her off-white, sling-back heels were also present at the scene, as well as her brown belted woolen overcoat. But, strangely enough, her black patent leather handbag and its contents were missing, including the headscarf she used to cover her hair curlers. Like the crime scene of Patricia Docker a year and a half earlier, a sanitary napkin was found discarded near the body. And like Patricia, an examination of the corpse revealed that Jemima had also been menstruating. Police were able to determine that on the night she disappeared, she had first gone to Betty's Bar, just across the street from the Barrowland, where she enjoyed a few drinks and was seen chatting with a red-haired man. She was later spotted at the Barrowland dancing with a person of the same description, and had left the dance hall in his company. According to witnesses, he was a slim young man approximately 25 to 35 years of age. He was tall, perhaps as tall as 6'2", sharply dressed in a blue suit with hand-stitched lapels and a white shirt. He had reddish, auburn, or dark hair, and some thought his appearance was almost too polished or upscale for the other clientele. He certainly wasn't a regular, or if he was, it was thought that he did not live in the area, as he wasn't recognized as a local. The couple was seen turning right onto Bain Street, then left onto London Road, before walking on towards Bridgeton Cross. From there, they took a shortcut by way of Landrecy Street and James Street. A later reenactment on the subsequent Saturday by a policewoman dressed in a similar fashion to the victim was made in the hopes that it would jog the memories of neighbors who might have seen something. This reenactment would determine that the whole trip was less than a mile in length, and it would take approximately 20 minutes to complete. One neighbor did report having heard screams from the vicinity of the tenement building on the evening of Jemima's murder, but she could not remember the specific time of the occurrence. Fearing not many witnesses would come forward due to the fact that the victim was connected to the over 25 nights at the Barrowland Ballroom, the police announced that any tips or information that they might receive from the general public would be kept entirely confidential. This appeal was even made in person at the Barrowland 2 nights after the discovery of Jemima's body. With the band temporarily silenced, officials announced that anyone with information about that night should contact them. No questions asked, and no judgments made. Despite the assurance that any infidelities might remain under the table and out of the public record, few people were able to provide anything more concrete that evening regarding Jemima or the sharply dressed man with her. For 2 months, police attempted to track down every possible witness who might have been at the Barrowland that night. A 100-pound reward, which was a decent amount for the time, was offered by Jemima's parents and 6 siblings, but still yielded no valuable information. 10 weeks after the crime, police officials began to piece together the similarities between Jemima's murder and the death of Patricia Docker over 18 months beforehand. It seemed more than just a coincidence. Both had apparently met their assailant at the over 25 nights at the Barrowland Ballroom. Both were dark-haired mothers in the same age range. Both had been raped and strangled, and while the first victim was found nude, both victims' handbags and their contents were removed from the scene. Both women had been menstruating at the time of their death, and both had sanitary napkins left near their bodies. And both had been killed and left in the near vicinity of their homes. Enlisting the aid of Lennox Patterson, the deputy director of the nearby Glasgow School of Art, the police assembled and released an identikit sketch to the press, based on what little eyewitness testimony they could collect. This would be a first in the history of Scottish criminal investigation, requiring special official permissions to be granted from the Crown Office. However, some within the police force worried that this would open the door for all sorts of legal challenges once they did identify their suspect and tried to pursue a court case. But even with a sketch of the assailant circulating the tabloids, no solid leads would materialize. Thursday, October 30th, 1969. It's a night of mischief for many children and adolescents. But for Helen Puttock, it's a chance to get out of the house and forget about the troubles of the day, along with her sister. Helen had just recently returned to Scotland with her husband George, a 10-year veteran and corporal with the British Army. He had been stationed overseas in Germany, and they were temporarily living with Helen's mother in her East Street flat in the suburb of Scottstown. George wasn't too keen on her going out dancing, even if it was just with her sister or with some of her neighborhood friends, but they assured him that it was something that the girls had done frequently in the past. Not wanting to begrudge her this little bit of fun, he relented. It would give his 29-year-old wife an opportunity to unwind and enjoy herself, and he would spend the time looking after their 2 children, 5-year-old David and 1-year-old Michael. When Helen's married sister, Jean Langford, oftentimes referred to as Jeannie, arrived early that evening to pick her up, George gave his sister-in-law a 10-shilling note. Though they intended to catch a bus to the dance hall, the money was for the luxury of a taxicab for their late-night journey home. The 2 sisters had seen the handbills and police notices regarding the 2 strangling crimes, including the police sketch of the suspect in the McDonald murder, but they were not particularly worried. They planned on spending the entire night together, and they would look after each other. Helen left wearing a black sleeveless dress and an imitation ocelot fur coat. George was still apprehensive. As the evening wore on, he decided to wait up for his wife's return. He would retire once she got in from her night out and his fears disappeared. When she hadn't returned by 2 a.m., he began to really worry. But by 3 a.m., he had nodded off in a deep sleep while waiting for her. Early the next morning, while walking his dog, neighbor Archibald McIntyre discovered the body of Helen Puttock face down in a back garden of the East Street flat. Her clothing was torn, and she had been beaten around the face and head, raped, and strangled with a stocking. The contents of her handbag were strewn about the yard, but the handbag itself was missing. Grass stains on her feet indicated that there had been a struggle, as she had apparently attempted to fight off or flee from her attacker. There was a bite mark on one of her wrists, and a semen stain on the stocking ligature around her neck. And, like the prior 2 victims, the woman's sanitary pad was removed, this time placed directly under her armpit. Some records indicate that this bite mark might have been on her leg or her ankle, but most publications state that it was her wrist that was bitten. Most accounts report a single, cheap cufflink was found near the body, but whether or not it belonged to the killer cannot be determined. George Puttock awakened that morning to find that Helen still had not returned. Glancing out the parlor window, he noticed a police caravan parked on the street. He exited his mother-in-law's flat and approached a nearby police officer, and without inquiring as to why they were present in the neighborhood, George explained that his wife had not returned from her night out and that she was still missing. When the officer heard this, he immediately asked George what his wife had been wearing the previous evening. When George mentioned her faux fur coat, the officer realized that he had inadvertently located the next of kin. In the investigation that followed over the next few weeks, the police discovered that after stopping at a local tavern for a few drinks with some friends, the two sisters arrived at the Barrowland at approximately 10 p.m. and proceeded to enjoy themselves. At some point during their outing, they met up with two gentlemen, both of whom gave their first names as John. They laughed about it at the time, and Jean later admitted that since so many at the over 25 nights were already involved or married, the two sisters didn't seem too concerned that their partners might not have been exactly honest or forthcoming. They were just there to have fun and dance, after all. Some accounts state that a sharply dressed red-haired man named John had bumped into Helen in between dances and struck up a conversation with her. Others state that Jean managed to lose some money inside a cigarette vending machine, and that the smartly dressed man had come to her aid, becoming belligerent with the Barrowland manager over the small sum lost. It was only 10 pence, but he forcefully insisted that the Barrowland refund her the money. In an incident which would have normally ended in bouncers ejecting a regular at the Barrowland, the manager, perhaps due to the appearance and bearing of this man, deferred, stating that if he were to return the next morning when the cash was emptied from the vending machine, he would gladly refund the money owed. Other accounts state that this cigarette machine incident had happened later in the evening, well after the foursome had already met and had been enjoying each other's company. This was also apparently just before they retrieved their coats from the cloakroom. At the end of the evening, the two sisters and the red-haired John parted ways with the other John, whose attention had been mostly focused on Jean. This John left them at the entrance to the Barrowland and began walking to a nearby bus stop. The three remaining companions hailed a cab, which took Jean to her home in Knightswood first, then proceeded to Scottstown. The cab driver confirmed leaving the couple at an address in Earl Street at approximately 1 a.m., with the red-haired man paying the fare. A similar individual in a nice, though slightly disheveled, suit and possibly with a bruised or scratched face was then seen at approximately 1:30 a.m. exiting a bus and heading in the direction of the River Clyde ferry. Even with this detailed account of Helen Puttock's last night, it would be Jean Langford's statement to the investigators that would provide the best portrait of this killer. In particular, the details of this cab ride home. Prior to the cab ride, Helen's beau had not volunteered much information about himself, and the sisters, with the two Johns, had spent only approximately an hour together in each other's company. However, according to Jean, this changed as soon as their journey had begun. The red-haired man had told them his name was either John Templeton, John Sempleson, or John Emerson, that he lived in the Castlemilk area of Glasgow with a relative, and that he was unmarried and employed with a lab. He was approximately 25 to 30 years old, nearly 6 feet tall, slim, with red hair and blue-gray eyes, and with one tooth slightly overlapping another in his upper front jaw. His fingernails were neatly trimmed, and his hands were very smooth, something that seemed very out of place for working-class Glasgow. Jean remembered that his trousers had no turn-ups or cuffs, and that his wristwatch had a wide leather band. She distinctly recalled that the brand of cigarettes he smoked was Embassy. He spoke with a Glasgow accent, but in a cultured and mannered way. One thing that Jean did surmise was that he had been in the military or police service at some point, as if he had an authoritative and slightly condescending judgmental air about him. He spoke of playing golf, although he claimed he wasn't as good as a cousin of his, who at one time had apparently managed to score a hole-in-one. All of this would seem rather ordinary or mundane, but the discussion veered towards religion, at which point their conversation took a remarkably weird turn. This stranger named John said that he had been raised in a very strict religious background with his sister, but that their upbringing had somehow failed to make them as good or pious as his mother and father wanted. His parents were both fervent teetotalers, and he said that his father had called dance halls dens of iniquity, and that married women who frequented such places were adulterers. He referenced or quoted scripture throughout the conversation, including mentions of the Old Testament and Moses. And when the subject of celebrating New Year's Eve was broached, he enigmatically stated, "I don't dance at Hogmanay, I pray." For those that are as in the dark as to the meaning of the word Hogmanay as I was, it's a Scottish word for New Year's Eve. The similarities between this murder, the recent murder of Jemima McDonald, and the much earlier killing of Patricia Docker were immediately noted by the authorities, with the detailed description of their suspect from the only living eyewitness who interacted with him that night. The police returned to Lennox Patterson, the same artist who had created the sketch of the killer of Jemima McDonald. This time, with substantially more to work with, Patterson produced a full-color painting of the suspect, which was released 7 weeks after the Puttock murder. The picture was widely distributed throughout the United Kingdom, and police, thinking that their suspect could be serving in the military due to his close-cropped hair and style of wristwatch, also released it to a number of foreign military bases and warships currently overseas. With officials stating their belief that the 3 murders were connected, and the publicity surrounding Jean and Helen's cab ride discussion with the mysterious man, the press was eager for a name. Some claim that enterprising journalist John Quinn of the Evening Times dreamed up the nickname to describe their suspect, while others believe the first mention of the moniker was in the Daily Record. But whatever the case, they dubbed him with the name by which he would forever be associated, something suitable. It was a name that was short, descriptive, and slightly eerie. This name was Bible John. Investigators descended on the Barrowland Ballroom, attempting to find anyone who could corroborate Jean Langford's story or provide additional details on the enigmatic Bible John. Some eyewitnesses remembered seeing Helen with a slim, red-haired man, while others described a man wearing a flecked brown single-breasted 3-button suit with high lapels, a white or blue shirt, and a dark tie with red stripes. Others remembered Bible John collecting a short brown tweed or gabardine overcoat from the cloakroom at the end of the night. Still, others remembered his wristwatch having a wide leather strap with a narrower strap threaded throughout, similar in fashion to the non-slip variety that was favored by servicemen at the time. And some others claim that this man may have quoted or referenced scripture, starting some sentences with such phrases as, "Well, the Bible says." Though whether this was an invention of half-drunken patrons with overactive imaginations, or story-hungry journalists eager to substantiate the nickname and sell more papers, is hard to determine. The Barrowland became a stakeout point too. 16 police officers, 2 of whom were women, were assigned to the city's dance halls to survey the over 25 nights, hoping to gain information to help catch the killer. This required a considerable effort. Investigators working undercover needed to blend in, and that would encompass everything from looking the part to acting it. The press humorously dubbed them the Marine Formation Dance Team. Joe Jackson, one of the detectives involved in organizing the group, said, "I learned a pretty mean samba through being involved in this aspect of the investigation." Constable Bruce Forsyth commented to a local newspaper, "When this inquiry started, I could hardly dance a step. Now I get better every week." Female officer Morag Cameron stated, "I must have been to hundreds of dances, and sometimes go to 5 ballrooms in one night." And policewoman Katrina Liddell reported, "We try as far as possible to vary our dresses, and on dance nights go to a lot of trouble to get ready." Police attempts to trace the only other witness close enough to the events of that night, the other John who danced with Jean and left them at the Barrowland entrance, came up empty. All that was known about this dark-haired John was that he also claimed to have hailed from the Castlemilk suburb of Glasgow, where he lived with his father and brother and worked as a labourer while attending night school. But no such person would come forward, or would be identified by anyone fitting that description or those circumstances. The Barrowland wasn't the only place that authorities would haunt in the days and weeks after Helen Puttock's murder. By the time the investigation had ended, over 100 policemen and detectives had searched Glasgow in an all-out effort to locate the killer. They combed through official military and NATO records, thinking their suspect might have been in the armed service at the time due to his wristwatch and short hairstyle. This might also explain the lapse between the 3 killings, specifically the 18-month gap between the Docker and McDonald murders. Perhaps Bible John had been stationed elsewhere, and that his visits to the Barrowland coincided with periods when he was on leave or off duty. The suspect's red hair also led police to interview over 400 barbers in the city. This wasn't an era known for men's short-cropped hairstyles, and they hoped that someone might remember a regular customer who favored such a military-style cut. Nearly 250 tailors were also questioned, in an effort to locate someone who might have fitted or altered a brown-flecked single-breasted suit, or a pair of trousers with no cuffs. A survey of dentist offices in the city turned up over 5,000 individuals whose dental records showed an overlapping front tooth in the upper jaw, but every single patient was cleared or exonerated. Jean Langford's memory of the casual mention of the suspect's cousin and his hole-in-one spurred the investigation to visit more than 400 golf courses throughout Scotland. Investigators were thinking that employees there might remember a red-haired man in the company of someone who achieved something so one-of-a-kind. Honing in on the religious content of much of the cab ride conversation, police visited dozens of churches, thinking that clergymen might remember a suspect resembling Bible John as a member of their congregation. An unsubstantiated report casting suspicion on the Masons sent a number of investigators to various lodges in the area. This caused a great amount of upset in some professional circles, whose members happened to be influential and important brethren. The efforts of the press also compounded the work for authorities. Detective Joe Jackson later lamented that news coverage of their undercover dance hall efforts was probably enough to scare their suspect away forever. The Scottish Daily Record invited Dutch psychic Gerard Croiset to Glasgow in early 1970 in order to help find Bible John. Despite pinpointing the suburb of Govan and describing particulars about the building where he lived, the psychic's information was not helpful. The door-to-door inquiries by the police in the area yielded nothing, with Detective Superintendent Joe Beatty describing the entire affair as a waste of time. If you're familiar with the podcast, you'll also recall that Croiset was called out to provide his psychic opinion for the missing Beaumont children in Australia, another search effort that came up with nothing. The 2 police sketches, in particular the second full-color painted portrait, became undeniably etched in the minds of investigators and the public in the months after Helen Puttock's murder. So convinced of a passerby's resemblance to the police sketch of the killer, one off-duty police officer obsessively leapt from his car and chased the man down the street. Slim, red-haired men were eyed cautiously, as was anyone who might even casually mention scripture in the nightlife scene. Leads poured into the police headquarters, and in all, over 50,000 tips were investigated and followed up on. By the time the inquiry was shuttered, over 5,000 different suspects had been identified, interviewed, and cleared. It was Scotland's largest manhunt, but by the end of it, the police were no closer to finding him than when they had begun. With no subsequent sightings or further murders, Bible John disappeared, fading back into the rhythm and rush of the Barrowland from which he had emerged. So, the question remains, what happened to Bible John? As suspected by some police, he could have been serving with the military at the time and was sent away, far from Glasgow. Maybe his circumstances suddenly changed, like getting married or switching careers, or he could have just simply moved from the area. In that regard, he could have been apprehended or arrested for some other crime and locked up in prison, or maybe even put away in a mental hospital. Or maybe he just got cold feet and realized that being identified by Jean Langford and having his picture distributed everywhere could cause his capture. Or maybe, as some researchers claim, there wasn't only one murderer, one singular Bible John. You can make a compelling argument either way whether or not these crimes were the work of the same killer. Maybe the slight differences between the crimes shows an evolution of Bible John's style and MO. All 3 victims had met their killer at the Barrowland Ballroom. All 3 were raped and strangled near their homes. All 3 had purses or handbags that were missing from the crime scenes, and all of them had been on their periods at the time they were killed, with sanitary napkins left on or near their bodies. But while there are many striking similarities, the subtle changes in the circumstances between the crimes lead us to a lot more questions. The timeline of the 3 murders is pretty unusual. An 18-month gap of time between the first 2 killings is not very common in multiple murderers, and the second and third murders occurred in much more rapid succession within 3 months of each other. Also, only the first victim, Patricia Docker, had her clothing removed from the crime scene, as well as the ligature which was used to strangle her. Perhaps there was a reason for this. At the third crime scene, Helen Puttock's sanitary napkin had been placed underneath her armpit. At the other 2 murders, the sanitary napkin had been discarded near the bodies. We could easily come to the conclusion that the police were too eager to link the first 2 crimes, inadvertently creating a serial killer when perhaps there wasn't one. And if that's the case, it could be that the second or third murders were copycat crimes, in some ways mimicking the killing of Patricia Docker. And finally, if these crimes weren't really connected and multiple killers were responsible, this could be the reason why the Bible John murders stopped. 2 of the signatures that link the Bible John killings are the missing handbags and the sanitary napkins. It's unclear why the 3 victims' handbags were taken from the crime scene. Only Patricia's handbag was found, tossed into the river cart near where she was killed, whereas with the later killings, the handbags were never recovered. Some investigators think that these might be some form of grim souvenir or trophy, or perhaps they were removed and discarded because they contained evidence of the victims' identities, and doing so would help throw the police off of the killer's trail. Perhaps if the police had also combed the areas near the later 2 crime scenes, the purses might have been recovered after all. The fact that all 3 of the victims were menstruating and all 3 had sanitary napkins left near or on their bodies is also noteworthy. Maybe the killer expected to quote-unquote get lucky, only to be sexually denied by his victims because they were on their periods, and this spurred him to attack in such a furious way. Or maybe the victims were targeted and killed specifically because of this, like some form of weird fetish, as if the very fact they were menstruating pushed Bible John over the edge to kill. All of this leads to the ultimate question. Who was he? We know a lot of suspects were interviewed and cleared, thousands of them in fact. We just don't know a lot about who they were. Many of the more recent developments name suspects who weren't tied to the crimes during the official inquiries, or if they were, there's no mention of them in the press or in the records available. In early 1996, the body of John Irvine McInnes, a furniture salesman and former member of the Scots Guard, was exhumed under the suspicion that he might have been the infamous Bible John, a cousin of one of the original suspects who was investigated at the time of the murders. McInnes had committed suicide in 1980 at the age of 41, having died from massive blood loss after he slashed the brachial artery in his arm in what police psychologists call a search for the ultimate thrill. An examination of cold cases the year before had linked the DNA sample taken from Helen Puttock's tights to a member of the McInnes family. However, due to the body's decomposition over the prior 16 years and the possible degradation of the original DNA sample from decades earlier, subsequent tests proved to be inconclusive. It was hoped that McInnes' dental remains could also be matched to the bite mark on Helen Puttock's wrist, but there was insufficient information about the wound, which prevented a positive match. Further testing was done in 2004, when it was announced that authorities had collected DNA samples from as many as 10 different suspects, who had been questioned during the original investigation more than 30 years beforehand. No names were ever released, but one of the men, the 58-year-old brother of a British rock star, admitted to voluntarily submitting the sample but denied having been Bible John. Police were able to determine that a DNA sample of one of these suspects, originally taken from a minor criminal offense in 2002, was an 80% match to that taken from the third Bible John crime. This led forensic experts to believe that if the Puttock sample had retained enough integrity over the many years in police storage since Helen's murder, her killer would be related to this suspect in some way. However, after further investigation, no additional samples were taken from other suspects and no follow-up testing was done. Recently, retired Glasgow detective Brian McLaughlin stated that he was convinced that the second suspect portrait, the one based off of Jean Langford's description, is wrong, and that the former manager of the Barrowland Ballroom described an altogether different man with Helen Puttock that night. This manager had been the one who got in the altercation with Bible John concerning the 10 pence lost in the cigarette vending machine. McLaughlin says that the manager and bouncers remember the man having darker, jet black hair, not the red hair described by Jean Langford. But This could have been the manager referring to the other John in their company, who Jean described as having dark hair, and who left them on his way to a nearby bus stop while the remaining three hailed a cab. This manager also stated that Jean Langford was excessively drunk that night when they exited the Barrowland, a claim that Jean vehemently disputed. She admitted to drinking on the night in question, but not in any excess. Definitely not so much that she could not recall memories from the night of Helen's murder. But if Jean had been in a heavily intoxicated state, this calls into question her entire detailed account of the cab ride and the conversation with her sister's killer. This might also explain why it was nearly 2 months after the murder that police finally took a comprehensive statement from Jean, at which point the details of the cab ride emerged, and which prompted them to create and release the second, more detailed portrait of Bible John. It could have been a situation in which Jean's memories of that night had either been dulled by the effects of alcohol or the passage of time. However, if Detective McLaughlin is quick to dismiss the general character of eyewitness testimony, it could be said that in downplaying the importance of Jean Langford's account, he might be overstating the importance of such testimony from the Barrowland manager, who he claims was very impressive as a witness, quote-unquote. After all, most witnesses at the Barrowland that night distinctly remember Helen Puttock's companion having red hair, while the management insisted he had jet black hair. And after numerous questionings and interviews, lead investigator and detective superintendent Joe Beatty became an outspoken defender of Jean Langford's testimony and eyewitness account. One thing that isn't clear about the original police investigation is to what degree Jean's story was verified by the cab driver who had driven the three of them home on the night of Helen's murder. After all, this man was the only other living eyewitness who could possibly have overheard the suspect's conversation with the two sisters, and he could have easily corroborated the details of Jean's story. Sometime after the murders, Helen Puttock's widower, George, sought out and interviewed this cab driver who had driven his wife, her sister, and Bible John on that fateful night. The driver's story, as recounted to George Puttock, was a little more elaborate than what had apparently been told to the police beforehand. According to the cabbie, he had been only driving with the trio for a short period of time, and he was pretty unfamiliar with the area. When this had become evident during the ride, Helen grew frustrated with the situation, and after they took a wrong turn, she insisted that he stop the cab before they reached her Earl Street address, and that she would leave from there. The suspect quickly paid the fare after she exited, then followed her across the street and appeared to get into a little bit of an altercation with her. Thinking it was only a lover's tiff, the cab driver did not intercede and drove away. Coincidentally, early in his career, the same retired Detective McLaughlin who discounts Jean Langford's description of Bible John was involved in the arrest of a Castle Milk resident named John Edgar during the original investigation after Helen Puttock's murder in 1969. Edgar had been apprehended outside the Barrowland Ballroom and charged with loitering and suspicious behavior, but had escaped from police custody by jumping through a hospital plate glass window. He was eventually tracked down and exonerated, but a 2005 book naming him as the prime suspect in the killings prompted an irate 63-year-old Edgar to make a direct appeal to the press, in which he willingly offered a DNA sample for authorities to clear his name. Author Paul Harrison claims in his book, Dancing with the Devil, that Bible John had been a Glasgow police officer at the time of the murders. Harrison, himself a former policeman and one of the first UK officers to cross-train with the FBI's profile units at Quantico, said he could not publicly reveal the name of his suspect. This suspect, who Harrison said was still alive as of 2013, was continuing to draw a police pension. According to Harrison's research, on the night of the Puttock murder, Bible John had flashed a warrant card to the management and bouncers at the Barrowland Ballroom after they had gotten into the heated discussion of the cigarette vending machine. He also states that Jean Langford had at one point caught a glimpse of this warrant card, and that there was enough evidence to believe that the other John, who had courted and danced with Jean throughout the evening, had also been a police officer who was working undercover. This might explain why the management did not want to eject Bible John from the Barrowland after the argument over the lost money, and why no one ever came forward claiming to be the other John who had spent time with the suspect and the two sisters that night. Harrison also makes the claim that Jean Langford had seen the other undercover policeman John on numerous occasions at the Marine Police Station when she had been asked to view police lineups of possible suspects. For some, the most compelling suspect for the Bible John murders has been Peter Tobin, the notorious Scottish rapist and serial killer, who was convicted of 3 murders between 2007 and 2009. Criminologist David Wilson, who co-authored a book connecting Tobin to the Bible John killings, claims that the murders for which Tobin was found guilty may not have been his earliest, and that it is highly likely that he had killed much earlier in his life. Peter Tobin's first murder conviction was for a killing he committed in his early 60s, which most experts say is a late age for anyone to start killing, especially someone who would go on to commit additional murders afterwards. Wilson also claims that the murder of Patricia Docker could have been Tobin's first, and that the 18-month gap between her killing and that of Jemima McDonald would not be uncommon if this was the case. In Wilson's book, he cites serial killers such as Jeffrey Dahmer, who also had a significant gap of time between his early murders. Tobin had been living in Glasgow as late as 1969 before marrying and moving to Brighton. Shortly after the Puttock murder, he was arrested and sentenced to a term of 13 months. According to his first wife Margaret, who he had met at a Glasgow dance hall, he was a very smart dresser, charming and suave at first, yet eventually he became sadistic, manipulative, and cruel. Margaret also stated that Tobin's sexual appetite was not dulled by the fact that his partner might have been on her period. In fact, it gave him more of a kick, she told one Scottish television program in an interview. When Joe Jackson, who had been a part of the original dancing squad of detectives assigned undercover at the dance halls in 1969, learned of Tobin's arrest, he noted a distinct facial similarity between him and the sketches of Bible John. At the same time as the Bible John murders, Tobin had a tooth removed from his upper jaw, causing a noticeable gap, which some authorities thought might have explained Jean Langford's description of the suspect having an overlapping tooth. And one of Tobin's preferred aliases was John Semple, which Jean Langford might have misheard as the Templeton, Sempleson, or Emerson surname during the cab ride. Yet, despite these similarities, there are some glaring differences between Tobin and the man suspected of being Bible John. Though both had a slim build, Tobin's height of 5'6" is nowhere near the 6 foot the Barrowland witnesses and Jean Langford described, nor is his hair color auburn or red. At the time of the murders, Tobin would have only been 22 or 23 years of age, slightly younger than the mid-20s to early 30s of the witness statements. This would make him younger than all 3 of the Bible John victims, whereas Tobin's confirmed rape and murder victims were mostly adolescent or in their late teen years. All 3 of Bible John's victims were killed near their homes and left in public places to be found soon afterwards, whereas Tobin concealed the bodies of his 3 murder victims. All 3 of the Bible John victims had been strangled, and Tobin had been known to use a knife during his attacks. However, a change in murder weapons is not uncommon in some serial killers. Peter Curtin, the vampire of Dusseldorf, deliberately switched from knife to scissors to hammer in an effort to throw the police off of his trail, and to convince them that his attacks were not related. Though he had been raised in a Roman Catholic household when he was a boy, Tobin's former wives maintained that he had no interest in God or religion, not once quoting or referencing scripture in their presence. And while the timeline of Tobin living in the area of Glasgow matches up with the Bible John killings, his first wife stated that they were away from the area on their honeymoon at the time of Jemima McDonald's murder, and that their move to Brighton occurred before the death of Helen Puttock. Tobin has notoriously avoided interviews with researchers and journalists, and refuses to cooperate with the police on any investigation of possible crimes to which he hasn't been connected or charged. Despite appeals to decency and for closure for the family members of his other potential and unproven victims, during one interrogation, he callously sneered, "I don't give a fuck about them." In 2015, in what some might characterize as rough justice, a fellow prisoner, himself a convicted child rapist, slashed Tobin with a razor, leaving an 8-inch scar across his face and permanently disfiguring him. As of 2017, Tobin refuses to leave his prison cell for fear of subsequent attacks, and prison authorities have described the once infamous serial killer as a frail, frightened old hermit. Jean Langford, Helen Puttock's sister and the only living eyewitness to encounter Bible John, passed away in 2010. Jean adamantly denied that Tobin was the man with whom she had shared the taxicab ride with on the night of her sister's murder. According to her eldest son, Paul, she admonished 5 days before her death that Tobin was indeed Bible John. The rest of the remaining family discounts this claim, stating that Paul made up the entire deathbed confession. "My dad's talking rubbish," Paul's own daughter told reporters, and, referencing her recently deceased grandma, said she never talked about Tobin. In that same year, a 63-year-old woman named Julia Taylor claimed she was 100% certain that Tobin approached her at the Barrowland Ballroom and asked her to dance during the same time period as the killings, and that she only just recognized his picture after having seen news reports of criminologist David Wilson's book linking Tobin to the Bible John killings. She remembers being separated from her friends that night, and that Tobin, who was neatly dressed and seemingly slightly out of place, approached her, introducing himself as Peter, and pestering her to accompany him to a party he was attending in the suburb of Castlemilk. He insisted on dancing with her in the more private, quieter upstairs ballroom instead of on the main, more crowded dance floor, and that when she declined his many offers, his behavior became menacing and odd. Upon deciding to leave, he shadowed her to the entrance of the Barrowland in a threatening manner, and glared at her as she left in such a hurry that she couldn't properly don her overcoat. She ended up hiding on the bus on the ride home in fear of him following her. Also, in 2010, another woman claimed that when she was 15 years old, she had met Tobin at the Barrowland in 1968, which was the same year that Patricia Docker was killed, and that Tobin had sexually assaulted her. The Barrowland Ballroom still stands today, and it continues to be a premier venue for music acts in the city. Despite some cosmetic changes, the owners and management have made a dedicated effort to retain and preserve much of the interior since it reopened after the fire over 50 years ago. "If it ain't broke, don't fix it," said one manager in a newspaper interview about the longevity of the place. Local folklore has it that when David Bowie was scheduled to play there once, a porcelain star became dislodged from the ceiling decor and nearly fell on him during an afternoon soundcheck before the show. The musician casually picked it up and pocketed it. Years later, when asked about the souvenir, Bowie claimed to have kept it in the bathroom of his home in France. The grim specter of Bible John still hangs over Glasgow in the decades since his disappearance, gone, but certainly not forgotten. He has become a boogeyman of sorts, the kind of legend whose visit parents would threaten their children with when they misbehaved. One former bouncer at the Barrowland reminisced, "I think the memory of Bible John still haunts the place all these years later. He's an unwanted part of the folklore, if you like. For years after, every night I worked there would always be one lass who saw Bible John, or recognized his face on a punter." Years after the murder of Jemima McDonald, a resident of the suburb where she lived remembered the profound effect it had on the city. All these years later, I don't think McKeith Street can be mentioned anywhere in Bridgeton and other parts of Glasgow without Mima McDonald being remembered. I know it's Bible John who gets most mentions, but Mima was a lovely girl, a smashing lass who didn't deserve the life she had, or to die in such terrible circumstances. She was a loving mother with 3 lovely kids. Life can be so cruel sometimes, and it makes all the more distressing to think that her killer got away with doing what he did. People around here will never forget. If they ever do catch him, then I hope he gets his just rewards. It might be 25 years since it happened, but that man is still the most despised character in the city. To this day, the identity of the figure known as Bible John is unknown, and this story remains unresolved.